Once upon a time, there was a village far from any kingdom. This village had struggled every day with the many dangers of the woods. Bandits who would steal from any merchant who dared step in their territory, werewolves who hunted sheep in the night, and even a vampire who were once lords over the village were now parasites in the ruined towers. The villagers were plagued by these beasts and more, so they sent a desperate letter to their nearest neighbor, asking for knights to help. This letter was carried by a phoenix, who flew off in search for help. Instead of finding a human village, it came across a village of monsters, living in the Forbidden Mountains. The chief of the monsters read the villagers' desperate plea, and his heart melted. So he recruited his best knights and gave them very specific orders as he sent them to the village. The 3 knights arrived as the sun was setting. In their armor, they could have been anyone. The villagers were so desperate for any help, they didn't bother asking why some of the knights stood taller than a house, or why some of the knights never bothered to remove their armor during the night. Nor did the villagers ask why the knight's seal had a one-eyed skull with a pair of bat wings. That night, when the werewolves came for the sheep, one of the knights, by the name of Azam the Mighty, stood guard of the sheep. Azam carried 2 mighty weapons. In his right hand he carried a shepherd's crook, made out of a mighty oak that was dipped in wolfsbane. Careful not to touch his skin, because even wolfsbane could cause a giant to become ill. In Azam's left hand he wielded an iron sword, sharper than a razor and longer than Azam was tall, and it reflected the moonlight so well it looked like it brought the moon down to earth. The werewolves were attracted by the moonlight in Azam's blade, and they approached and howled. When they saw they were so close to the light, they saw wolfsbane. The alpha of the pack, a wolf with shimmering gray fur and sharp fangs the size of knives, and the howl that could be heard from miles away, this alpha attacked Azam. The alpha mistook the crook as Azam's primary weapon, and tried to wrestle it away from the giant knight's grip. Instead, Azam threw the crook as far as he could, causing the werewolves to chase after it, for it was their instinct to fetch was stronger than their instinct to fight. The alpha, staring at Azam with her red eyes, snarled and leapt at Azam, trying to tear at his throats. Instead, Azam lifted his gauntleted right arm to have the wolf chomp on the metal. Now, dragging the alpha wolf, who was trying to bite through the metal, Azam swung his iron blade over the werewolf's head. The wolf let out a long howl that melted into a woman's cry. What was once the alpha wolf was now an old woman, clad in gray wolf's furs, crying on the ground. Now finally free from her curse, the woman turned to see her returning werewolf children. They were fighting over the crook like puppies with a stick. Even in her human form, the woman could hear her pups' confusion. They no longer recognized their mother. All they saw was that their mom disappeared and there was prey in her place. The woman turned away from her family and hid her face in her furs, hoping not to feel their claws or their teeth. Instead, the woman heard the other wolves' howls become the cries of children. After a few moments, the cries died down, and the woman felt a familiar warmth. Her pups were snuggling her. Just they were no longer pups, but rather human children. Opening her eyes, she saw her pack were now young children with their own wolf furs. The curse was now broken for them all. The werewolves were no longer forced into wolf form by the moon. They could still turn with magic and their fur, but now the werewolves were no longer cursed by the moon. Azam, by slicing over their heads with an iron blade, cut them off from their connection to the full moon. Now, fully free for the first time in years, the woman wept. She was free, but she was no longer going to be welcome in her village, since she had stolen from them for so long, trying to keep her children fed. Azam leaned down to the woman, and he whispered directions to her. He told her where in the woods she could find a knight with a curiously shaped helmet, where if the knight removed his armor, his wolf fur cloak would become his skin, and he would howl at the moon. Where that werewolf knight would be able to bring the woman and her pups to safety in the monster's village. The woman thanked Azam and left that night. In the morning, Azam boasted that he saved the sheep, and that no more wolves would wander near the flock. The villagers rejoiced at such news and celebrated with a great feast in his honor. However, after the feast, a villager and a different knight stumbled into the woods, drunk on both vino and victory, as they were beset by the bandits. The bandit leader lifted his knife to the villager's throat, asking for the villager's money. The villager cried out not to kill him, and he handed his coins to the bandit leader. The bandit leader counted the coins as his accomplices held the knight at knife point. The knight was a woman who was very pale and whose frame carried no muscle and no fat. She walked like she was a stick that had learned how to walk, each step sliding into the next step with a slick noise. Slick, slick, slick. The bandits, thinking this was an easy theft, bragged about how weak the knight looked. Surely she was just a squire, or maybe even a camp maid. The knight said nothing and stood there, stoically. Even after threatening the life, the woman's dark eyes showed no fear to the bandit leader. So, now realizing she wasn't going to hand over her coin purse, the bandit leader took out his cutlass and slashed at the woman's throat. The woman's head rolled onto the ground, and yet her body still stood. At first, the bandits watched with bated breath, seeing if the knight would fall after her head. Instead, the woman's body reached to the cutlass and stole the blade from the bandit leader. After taking his blade, the woman's body reached down and picked up her severed head, setting it neatly back on her neck, where it belonged. Still, even with her body intact, the knight's illusion was now shattered, and revealed that the thin woman was actually a skeleton. Her knight's cloak clung to her bones like rags over a dry bush. Her ribs rattled in the breeze, and her breath was as non-existent as a breeze in a cave. Her black eyes were empty sockets, free of even the humanity that was carried by a corpse. And the slick noise was the noise of her bones moving together. The knight tilted her empty head as if considering something, and then chattered her teeth at the bandits. The bandits, in fear of this undead creature, dropped all they carried and ran as far as they could go. They ran and ran and ran, never to return nor to bother any other villagers or any other village. Now, with the bandits gone, the skeletal saver reached down and picked up to pull up the villager and handing him his coins. The villager, in shock, was not sure how to respond, but he was surprised to see the skeleton lift her finger to her teeth as if she was shushing him. The skeletal knight carried all that the bandit stole on her back. The villager offered his strength and aid, but she only shook her skull, indicating that she wanted to carry it herself. She had no muscles to tire, no breath to run short, and no heart to grow weary. Still, to the villager, his companion had shown more backbone than any other human he'd ever met. Leading the villager back to the village, the skeleton's illusion soon returned. Now fully intact again, the villager asked the skeleton what her name was. Walking onwards with silent slicks, the skeleton seemed to think deeply before answering the villager. "My name is Orn," she said with a whisper so soft it may have just been the wind whistling in her bones. When night came again, the knights went out to the woods to search for the towers. Finally, seeing a tower of the great vampire lord, the vampiric knight Otho walked into the tower herself. Clad in her shining armor, she contrasted sharply when she found the vampire lord. In the night, she was like a constellation that had fallen to earth. Her armor carried pearls that glowed, and the armor itself was as silver as the moon. Her cape swept behind her with all the sound and power of a cloud moving across the moon. Her sword was so heavy that 3 strong men couldn't lift it without strain, and she bore it with as much difficulty as a child carrying a stick. The tower she sought out the vampiric lord was long since past its glory. The steps were worn down by thousands of footsteps. The walls were more moss than stone, and more wrought than wood. The tapestries long since torn away, the last threads too worn for even the most starving moth to eat, and in this place Otho sought out her prey. In a distant corner on the abandoned tower, the vampiric lord was dressed in what were once rich silks, now filthy rags. His once strong presence was desperate now, like a possum running from a butterfly. His frame was even thinner than Orn the skeleton, and his eyes were dark from no rest, and his sight was long since faded from the world. His claws and fangs were weak and brittle with age, and his mind long since too full of his glory days to think about his gross present. He once led armies, and now he was alone by himself, the last of his armies long since starved, waiting for him to give an order. He was no proud predator. He was nothing more than a pathetic parasite who sold an entire kingdom for one more day to live. A scavenger willing to consume garbage that was not even fit for the roaches and rats. A shadow that only scared those that feared the unknown. Otho crouched down to look the vampire lord in the eye, and she saw no recognition in his eyes, nor any spark of what he once was. No desire to hunt, no desire to lead, no desire to change, and not even a desire to live. Only the fear of death had kept him alive in such deplorable conditions. She sighed and took out a vial of pure holy water. Popping open the cork, she left it on a rock, and left the tower where the vampire lord lived. Otho knew that desperate animal sought out water before food, and since it was open and in front of him, the vampire beast wouldn't question where the water came from, or what it would do to him once he did drink it. Otho was sad to see the state that her father was in, but she knew this would be for the best. He gave up his humanity for immortality. He gave up his kingdom for a feast. He traded his daughter for a wife, and now he would trade his curse for a drink. In the morning, the villagers celebrated the knight's return. They would always welcome the knights and their families every time they did return, and if sometimes those knights were strange or even unseen, well, so what? To the villagers, the knights were heroes, and that was worth more to the villagers than the few secrets. In time, the 2 villages would become closer and closer, until it was eventually one village, and no one needed to hide anymore. Where humans would not fear what lay in the dark, because what was in the dark was their neighbors, their friends, and their families. Where monsters would not be afraid to hide from the light, because in the light there's only warmth and acceptance, and most importantly, love. And that is the tale of the Lost Knights. Thank you.